Hi, I read 57 books in 2023 and I'm gonna go through them, give a little explanation, give my rating, and otherwise I'm hoping this will be a reasonably timed video. The very first book I read in 2023 was The Silence of the Girls by Pat Parker. I gave this 4 stars. This is a retelling of Briseis during the Trojan War. I think the Trojan War and the Iliad are so interesting, and Briseis is one of my absolute favorite characters. Sam got this for me at some point, and it was a great one to start off the year with. It was a little bit slow, a little bit hard to read. It definitely reads more like a classic, but I really liked this retelling and focusing on the women of Troy, and I'm looking forward to reading the next one, which I have on my TBR for this year. Next, I half read and half listened to Love in the Time of Serial Killers by Alicia Thompson. This was okay. I gave it 2.5 stars. 2.5 is kind of my like average rating. I wasn't thoroughly entertained, but I also didn't dislike it enough to DNF it. I could see someone who was into romance novels a little bit more enjoying it, but that's just not usually my genre. I only picked it up because I absolutely love this cover, and so I went for it, but it was just okay. Next, I read Burnt Sugar by Avni Doshi. I picked it up, I'd never heard of it. I picked it up because of this just absolutely stunning cover. I love these colors together. I love her in the background. This is a story about an Indian woman and her relationship with her mother and how it often becomes more fraught the older you get in life, but you're also starting to look back and understand some of the choices they made more once you're an adult. I gave this 3.5 stars. I don't think I would ever reread it. It was a little slow at times, but I also just think that that relationship is so interesting, especially to hear it from an Indian woman and specificities of their culture. After that, I reread Daisy Jones and the Six by Taylor Jenkins Reid. As you probably know, this is one of my favorite books. It's just such a good palate cleanser. It's something I know I'm gonna enjoy and get through. This is the first time I read it after I owned it, so I put lots and lots of tabs. I love it. My favorite thing about the story though is I was just getting an urge to reread it. I wanted to reread it before the TV show came out, and I sat down one night and I can read the whole thing in one sitting. And I went to log it in Goodreads, and it was exactly a year later from the first time that I had read it, like to the day. And so I've just decided that every year I think I'm gonna reread Daisy Jones and the Six on February 24th because I somehow did it accidentally the first time around. This is a 5-star for me. In between some of those, I read a nonfiction book called Superfan: How Pop Culture Broke My Heart by Jen Sukfong Lee. This cover is astounding, and I just loved the title. I myself am a super fan, a fangirl of so many TV shows and movies and books that I, have affected me my whole life. And so I absolutely loved getting to read someone else talk about things like that. And I just thought that this was fantastic. I'll probably reread it at some point. If nothing else, I will keep it on my shelf and suggest it to lots of people because I enjoyed my time reading it. After that, I read The Course of Love by Alain de Botton. I gave this one 4 stars. And I talked about it a lot in my top 10 reads of 2023 if you want to hear more about it, but I would compare this the most to 500 Days of Summer. This just reads like it's being narrated by Tom, and so if you love that movie, I would suggest picking this one up. After The Course of Love, I listened to Cobble Hill by Cecily von Weizsäcker. I give this a 2.5 stars. Again, this isn't really the genre that I usually read in, but I absolutely adored the cover of this book. It's like a big city life, lots of different POV's book, and I didn't dislike it. It just didn't strike me as anything that I would ever return to or even like remember totally what happens in it. But I listened to that one, and then I also listened to The Girl He Used to Know by Tracy Garcia Graves. I gave this one 2 stars. It was just okay. After that, I read on my Kindle, but later bought the physical copy for Harry Potter and the Sorcerer's Stone. This is the very first time I read these, and I don't know when the videos are coming out, but I made a whole video on my thoughts on all of these, but I really enjoyed my time finally getting into them. I gave this one in particular 3 stars. Another one that I talked about in my top 10 videos of 2023 is The Maidens by Michaelades. I gave this a 4.5 stars. This is just the exact kind of thriller that I want, and I want to find more authors like him. After The Maidens, I read Luster by Raven Leilani. I gave this 3 stars. I had heard so many great things about it on Book Talk and BookTube, and this was one that I didn't totally love, but there were some great quotes and bits in it and something to get out of it, so I'm so glad that I read it. At the end of March, I read Now Is Not the Time to Panic by Kevin Wilson. I borrowed this from the library and gave it 3 stars. In the past, I had read, what was that book called? Nothing to See Here by Kevin Wilson. And I loved it, and it was so different than anything that I usually like. And so I am always tempted to read more of his things. And Nothing to See Here was easy to get into. It was easy to read. I enjoyed my time reading it. I don't totally remember what it was about, so it's not something that it totally stuck with me afterwards. So I landed on a 3.5. And also the hardback cover, so much exponentially better than the paperback cover. Always a shame when that happens. After that, I read A Life-Changing Strangers I Know by Claudia Durastani. I talked about this in my top 10 of the year. I would highly recommend reading this if you're okay with genre blending. This is a fictionalized retelling of some nonfiction events from the author's life, and she does it for a very specific reason, which she details in the back of the book. But it's just this idea that sometimes when we look back on our memories or on the things that affected us, it's not always like the cold hard facts. Sometimes it's the books and the movies and the TV shows that we fell in love with. Sometimes it's a person that you fell in love with in your head and you created this whole life with them and romanticized and imagined and daydreamed, and that affects you and becomes part of your life. So if you're okay with genre bending, and probably also if you're a romantic, I would highly suggest picking this one up. And also just this cover, I mean, it's the reason I picked it up in the first place. Highly recommend. I keep confusing myself because I'm switching back and forth between Goodreads so I can see the order that I read them in, and my own like Google Sheets creation that I made specifically because Goodreads sucks, but also so that I could notate like rereads and the format that I read them in and whether or not I own them, but specifically half stars, because Goodreads not having half stars doesn't make any sense. I want them to take some notes from Letterboxd, being able to do half stars and then being able to like heart something when you liked it, because sometimes those are different. Sometimes you rate something low but you enjoyed it and you want to put a heart next to it. So anyways, I'm confusing myself because I'm flipping back and forth between those two things on my phone. Next, I read The Silent Patient by Michaelades. I gave this 4.5 stars as well. I also read this in one day. I devoured it. It's on my top 10 of the year. Another thriller. I preferred this one to The Maidens personally, but the idea of the new one that came out is like right up my alley. So I cannot wait to read that one. Then we go into a huge span of time that I read a whole bunch of books on my Kindle, and during this time I had Kindle Unlimited, so I read a whole bunch in a row off of there. One that I might have bought actually was Being Lolita, a memoir by Alison Wood, I gave this 4 stars. Lolita by Nabokov is one of my favorite books, and I wanted to do a deep dive into some of the either newer retellings of it or memoirs or gender switching or whatnot, different narration style, different POV, and this was the memoir I read. I mean, it's a devastating read. It's something that you definitely like have to read a filler book afterwards. It's not for the faint of heart, but it was extremely well written and it's a great cover as well. My filler book afterwards was The Housemaid by Frida McFadden. I read this so quickly. I for sure read it in one day. I gave it 3 stars. The story was more of a 2.5, but it was 3 because it kept me entertained and I wanted to finish it. Immediately after, I read the second one, The Housemaid's Secret, which I gave the same rating. Sometimes it's important to just read like easy, fast books. That's what like keeps me loving reading and not getting into a rut. So yeah, both of those were okay, but I needed those books at the time. While I was reading those, I was also at the same time reading Cloud Atlas by David Mitchell. This was in my top 10 videos of the year if you want to hear more about it, but I read this with my best friend as a little book club, took a ton of notes and tabbed a whole bunch. This is a masterpiece. It's hard to get through and some of the sections aren't interesting or are slow or I couldn't get into, but it was still incredibly good and I'm so proud of myself for getting through this. Then back to the Kindle, I read My Dark Vanessa by Kate Elizabeth Russell. This was a 3.5 star for me, and this was continuing my reads that had to do with Lolita, so it's about a teacher-student relationship. This is a novel, but it's a modern novel, and it really grapples with the idea of the student growing up still thinking that it was a choice that she made and being afraid that her agency will be taken away from her if she admits that this was an abusive relationship. Yeah, I liked this take on it. It was extremely interesting. After that though, I read Tampa by Alyssa Nutting. I gave this a 2 star just because it was well written, but this was the hardest one for me to get through. This was the gender swap. So this is a female teacher and a young male student. And I thought this one, the way it was written, really crossed the line between educational, psychological exploration of the topic into like a weird like kink at times. And most of the time I just felt extremely gross reading it. Out of everything that explores this topic, this would be the one that I would not recommend. So then I got back into reading physical format and I read The Atlas 6 by Olivie Blake. This is not usually my kind of genre. I'm not a fantasy person. But Sam read this and said, hey, this is your version of it. I loved the idea of the mystical powers that these people have because they're based off of like realistic things. Like it's like taking the concept of like empathy and someone being so empathetic that it's like almost a superpower. And I loved that concept of it. And then on top of it, it was just beautifully written. And the idea of the intro with the Library of Alexander was fascinating. I marked the shit out of the whole thing, but especially the beginning section, the prologue. I have the second one on my shelf, my TBR for this year, and then hopefully I'll be ready to read the third one by the time it comes out in paperback. I gave it 4 stars, and this probably would have been the 11th book on my top 10 of 2023, so it just barely missed the cut. Also, I love this physical copy of it. The shape and size of this one is perfect. Got back to Harry Potter after this and read The Chamber of Secrets. Again, I read this on my Kindle and listened to it, bought the physical format later, used. I love this one a lot, much more than the first one. Then I listened to The Guilt Trip by Sandy Jones. I initially bought it in paperback because of this cover, but also because this is an amazing title. I ended up listening to it because I couldn't get into it reading, and I didn't like it that much. I gave it 2.5 stars. Just like the other ones in this category, I didn't mind listening to it, but I just ultimately don't remember a ton about it. It didn't stick with me, so that's that one. At the same time, I was also reading Carrie by Stephen King on my Kindle with Sam for our book club. I gave this one 3 stars. I have tried to read a couple of Stephen King, and I really wanted to get into it because I'm beginning to love the horror genre, and obviously he's the king of it, but also he just has so many and I would never run out of things to read. But I don't love the way he writes, which sucks, and is weird because I also love his memoir on writing, which I read in high school and was very influential to me. But I don't love the way he writes. And Carrie in particular, the things I did like was how he wrote about religious trauma, and the inclusion of her and her mother's relationship was extremely interesting to me, but ultimately didn't love it, gave it 3 stars. My religious trauma is showing a little bit. Next, I listened to The House and the Cerulean Sea by TJ Klune. I had this one in paperback and recently gave it to my sister because I think she would enjoy it a little more than I did. I gave it 3.5 stars. I enjoyed it. I thought it was a great concept, especially the characters of all of the children were extremely interesting and entertaining to me, but I didn't love the main character's character, which I know is like kind of the point, is that he's a stick in the mud before he gets there, but wasn't my fave. Next, I started my love affair with Annie Ernaux. I read The Possession first. This was included in my top 10 of the year. It's teeny tiny. I would love to read all of her stuff. Extremely thought-provoking and quotable, and makes you want to pick up your journal afterwards and write about the things that she talks about. I gave this 4 stars. After buying it at Vroman's in Pasadena, I read The Seas by Samantha Hunt. I picked it up because I had heard so much about it, and also this cover is just too cute. I loved the idea of a young woman who thinks she's a mermaid. It was so interesting and so well written and so short. I would love to read it again to get more out of it. I love not being able to decide if it's really like something magical that's happening to her or if it's just a fantasy inside her head that she believes so much. Super interesting. I gave this one 3.5 stars. Finishing out May was Dave Grohl's memoir called The Storyteller. I listened to this one. His voice is just so cute. And I later picked up the paperback. I gave this one 4 stars. I grew up loving the Foo Fighters. It was a band that my dad really liked, that I've continued to love on my own, especially because of Dave Grohl. I think he just seems like the sweetest, coolest man in real life. I would love to get to know him. I feel like this would be a famous person that you would meet and you wouldn't be disappointed by. I thought this was great. I loved supporting him and I loved listening to his voice. Starting off June, I read Call Me By Your Name by Andre Ackman, mostly at the beach, which felt very fitting. I ended up giving it 3 stars because I didn't think it was very affecting, but I'm glad that I have now read it nevertheless. After that, I read Once More With Feeling by Alyssa Sussman. I loved Funny You Should Ask, as again, I'm not usually a romance genre person, but that was a book that I absolutely devoured and enjoyed so much, and so I knew that I could get into another one of her books. I gave this one 3.5 stars. Ultimately, I liked Funny You Should Ask a little bit more, but I'll read any of the books that come out in this world. Similarly, I read Happy Place by Emily Henry next. I gave this 3 stars. I thought that the emotion and the sincerity behind it was great and sweet, but it's not something that has affected me long term. I just wanted to read something of hers after everybody has fallen in love with her writing, but I don't know if I'll get into anything else of hers, again mostly just because it's just not my genre. Another 3-star afterward was Woman Eating by Claire Coda. I picked it up because of this gorgeous cover. This one just didn't totally work for me. I don't know if I'll get into any of the other ones or if the whole like cannibalism thing is just like not a subject that I'm super interested in. Or I guess this wasn't totally cannibalism, it was she's a vampire. But I feel like they go together, especially in modern retellings of it for some reason. But anywho, didn't totally love this, wouldn't really suggest it to anyone. Just after, I read Really Good Actually by Monica Hesiey. This was in my top 10 of the year. It felt so relatable. Some of the things that she was writing in her narration, I was like, other people think like that or have had these thoughts before. I'm not alone. I know this one has mixed reviews, but I personally really related to it and enjoyed the way it was written. I gave this 4 stars and plan to get it in paperback soon. Another 4-star afterwards, I had a good little run here, was The Marriage Plot by Jeffery Eugenides. This was also in my top 10 of the year. I love the way that Jeffery writes. I will read anything that he's written. Virgin Suicides is a beautiful, beautiful modern classic. And it was so great to read something else of his. Yeah, watch top 10 of the year if you want to hear more about it. Right after, another top 10 of the year was Franny and Zoe by J.D. Salinger. This was just like a classic that I wanted to get to at some point, and it's a super quick read, and I gave this 4 stars. A random book that I picked up at some point was The Last Thing He Told Me by Laura Dave. I read this in one sitting. It wasn't groundbreaking thematically, but it was a short, quick, easy read that kept me hooked the whole time and asking what was coming next. Ultimately gave it 3 stars, again for a lack of kind of like originality, but I enjoyed my time reading this. Then I read The French Exit by Patrick DeWitt. I read it because I wanted to watch the movie, which I thought looked really good, and then I realized when I filmed one of my unhaulings a couple of months ago that I never ended up watching the movie. So I need to still do that. The book I gave 3 stars, and kind of a reverse of The Last Thing He Told Me. I thought the story was relatively original and interesting, but I didn't love the way that it or the characters were written. Next, I read Prisoner of Azkaban. I gave this one 3.5 stars. Next, I did a reread with Sam for book club of My Forever and Always, The Great Gatsby. This was a quick read since I've read it so many times, but I still always manage to find something new in between the pages, and I just love it. I don't know. 5 stars, obviously. During that time, I was also reading Carrie Soto is Back by Taylor Jenkins Reid. This took me a month to read. I've read 4 of her books, and this is by far my least favorite. Tabs! I wondered where all my bookmarks went. Okay. Anyways, as I was saying, I've read 4 of Taylor Jenkins Reid's books. Daisy Jones and the Six, obviously, Evelyn Hugo, and Malibu Rising, and I loved all 3 of those, and I was waiting for this one to come out in paperback, and it just didn't catch me as much as those ones did. I still enjoyed my time reading it, but yeah, just didn't like it as much. I gave that one a 3. My next Annie Ernaux was Simple Passion. I liked this one less than I did The Possession, but I wonder if I would have liked this one better if I had read it first, because they deal with very similar subjects, so I felt like I was getting a lot of the same themes and stories in this one as I did in The Possession. I ended up rating this one 3.5. Next, I read Harry Potter and the Goblet of Fire. This is around the time that I started listening to them fully on audiobooks, because I just felt like that was how you're supposed to read Harry Potter for the first time. It was usually kids having their parents read them to them at night, you know? And this is a chunk. I didn't fully realize until I got them in paperback, but I really love this one. I gave it 4 stars. Next, I read The Only One Left by Riley Sager on my Kindle. This one teeters back and forth between a 3.5 and a 4 star. This is where those quarter stars do make sense and come in. I would probably give it a 3.75. This was my first Riley Sager, and I love the like gothic horror haunted house vibe. That is everything that I have loved getting into the last couple of years. It, honest to God, would have been at least a 4, if not higher, if there were not 2,500 plot twists at the end. I wanted like the first one or two, and those were great, and I was like, oh my god, holy shit, he really pulled this thing together. And then he pulled out like 5 more. And I've heard that that's what he tends to do, so I'm not sure if I'll continue to like his books. But I still loved the way they were written and the gothic horror piece and a lot of the quotes. So I don't know. I feel like I'm still making up my mind on that one, and it will probably be more decided when I read more of his things. After that, I read Harry Potter and the Order of the Phoenix, the biggest of the group, and coincidentally enough, my absolute favorite one. I gave this 4.5 stars. Next, I read Crudo by Olivia Lang. I had never read any Olivia Lang before, and after reading this, I put, I think, all of her other books on my list. This is kind of just like a modern think piece, fiction piece, about someone living in today's society and culture and some of the impulsive or intrusive thoughts that may get in a woman's way. I thought this was really interesting and really well written, and I'm excited to read more of Olivia's things. The biggest thing about this book was that she stuck the landing. This was hovering in the star rating for me because I liked it, but it didn't seem to be anything like too different from other things that I had read. And then the ending was so good that sometimes like you have to give someone their flowers for knowing where and when to end the book. I gave this one 3.5 stars. Next, I read Earth Angel by Madeline Cash. Talked a little bit about this in one of my unhauling videos. The first short story, called Plagues, is one of the greatest things I have ever read, but then I didn't really enjoy a lot of the other pieces. I think I just need to stop reading short stories. I have one more book that's short stories that I'm gonna try to read this year, and then after that, I think I'm just gonna stop reading them. I don't know what it is about like the variation of having all of them in the same book, or that the voices change so much. I'm not sure, but I just don't like it. But I would highly suggest giving Plagues a read. This I gave 2 stars. Before going to watch the movie adaptation, I read Agatha Christie's Halloween Party, which I have like the movie tie-in version that's called The Haunting in Venice, because that's what the movie's called, so don't be confused by that. This was my first Agatha Christie. I thought it was interesting, but just wasn't totally my thing the way it was written. I gave it 3 stars. I ended up absolutely loving the movie, which the movie uses a lot of the themes and some of the characters, but isn't an accurate adaptation, which there's a foreword in this by the screenwriter explaining why he made the choices that he did, and I thought that that was super interesting. But at the end of the day, I didn't love this book, and I gave it 3 stars. Next, with my roommate, I read Fahrenheit 451 by Ray Bradbury. I had never read this before. It was just one of those that I somehow escaped needing to read in high school, but I'm glad that I read it as an adult, because I think I appreciate classics a lot more than I did when they were assigned to me, just like I feel most other people feel. There are some really, really fascinating and important thoughts and ideas in this book. My biggest qualm with it was that I didn't like the ending. I thought that it turned it into something else. I either wanted it to be a longer odyssey of sorts that explored this journey that he was getting ready to go on in the end, or I wanted it to be shorter and a tighter story. So it wasn't my favorite classic that I read, but I absolutely loved a lot of the thoughts in here, especially as someone who loves literature and art and thinks that they're the most important things in the world. So I gave it 3.5 stars. So that one was in October, and then I took about a month off of reading. I didn't mean to, I was just in a reading slump. And then I went to go see Faux, starring Saoirse Ronan and Paul Mescal, and it was a weird movie, and I think a lot of it was not done well, but I thought that the idea of it was extremely interesting, and it was written by Ian Reid. So Ian Reid wrote I'm Thinking of Ending Things, which became one of my favorite books. It is so well done. I love the way that it was written. And so I decided to go pick it up because if I loved the story from the movie and I already love the author and know that he does confusing plot twist psychological novels well, then I assumed that this was going to be a good read. And I was right. I still like I'm Thinking of Ending Things the best out of all of his books. But I gave this one 3.5 stars and I would reread it again. If you're looking to find a new slow burn psychological thriller author, I would highly suggest trying Ian Reid. He just does it like no one else that I've ever heard before. So then since Faux got me out of my reading slump, I decided to read the only other book by Ian Reid that I had not read yet, called We Spread. I had this on my shelf already. This is the most recent of his books. And honestly, I enjoy it the least out of all of his books, but he's still just such a fascinating writer and I'm happy to have read it. I gave this one 3 stars. I read one poetry collection this year and that was Sad Sexy Catholic by Lauren Badillo Malici. It is just this cute, teeny tiny, like perfect fun cover, amazing title. I heard a YouTuber talking about this. It's on Pink Pages. There were just so many things about it that were appealing. I didn't love all of the poetry in it, but I loved the idea of it and I loved the printing. This one is definitely going to warrant another read. I have found that poetry just like something in my noggin just like does not compute with poetry, so I want to give it another try, but I'll always keep it, I think, just for the purpose of having this on a coffee table. It's just fantastic. I gave this one 2.5 stars, which again is kind of my like average book star rating. My last 4 books of the year are the books that were included on my end of the year TBR. I first read Eileen by Atessa Moshfegh. Again, I loved my year of rest and relaxation, so I was happy to read something else by this author. The movie was coming out with Anne Hathaway and Thomasin McKenzie, and so I decided to pick it up. Ultimately, I liked it a lot less than I did my year of rest and relaxation, and I didn't totally love the movie either, but I don't feel like it was wasted time to read or watch either. So if there's something appealing to you in the description of either, I would suggest going for it, but I gave it 3 stars. Next, I have talked so much about it. This is my #1 book that I read this year, and it was Poor Things by Alasdair Gray. Sam and I read this for our book club in anticipation of the Yorgos Lanthimos film starring Emma Stone, and I'm just so happy that the movie brought our attention to this book because I loved the movie. I thought it was masterful, but this book is like nothing else I have ever read before. It is honestly mind-blowing. It brought up so many topics of consideration and thought between Sam and I. I love the way it was written. It was funny, and I'm just, yeah, so thankful that we read this. Thank you, Yorgos. Thank you, Alasdair Gray. And then my last 2 books of the year were Harry Potter and the Half-Blood Prince and Harry Potter and the Deathly Hallows. I gave this one 4.5 stars and this one 3.5 stars, and I'll talk about each of those more in the Harry Potter video.